"You should thank me for taking you." He said it on the night of their wedding, not cruelly, not with any particular emphasis, which made it worse. The Duke of Ashfare stood at the window of Moor Hall's south drawing room, his back to the candles and to his new wife, and delivered the remark the way a man might note the weather. It was raining, in fact. It had been raining since morning, when Eleanor Vane, 26, the last daughter of the Vanes of Haverfield Grange, had been married in a draughty York church, with fewer guests than fingers and less feeling than a ledger entry. She was not surprised by the remark. She had spent the long carriage ride north, preparing herself for variations of it, turning each likely cruelty over in her mind the way a surgeon familiarizes himself with a wound before touching it. She had been purchased, she knew it. Her father's debts had consumed Haverfield over 6 years, slowly and then all at once, and when Lord Ashfare's solicitor had arrived in November, bearing documents that were almost kind in their briskness, there had been nothing to negotiate. She had read every page herself. Seated at the writing table her mother had once used to compose letters to people who no longer called, and she had signed them without weeping. "Ah, your Grace is very kind," she said now from the settee, where she had been placed like a parcel awaiting inspection. "I am not kind," Ashfare replied. "I am efficient. You have an acceptable name, no alternatives, and sufficient wit not to embarrass me in company. The Vane debts are cleared. Haverfield stands. Your father retains the use of his study." He turned from the window then, and she saw his face properly for the first time in the firelight. He had been abstracted through the ceremony, his gaze fixed at some point above the nave, and the sight of it was unexpectedly arresting. He was perhaps 33, broad-shouldered and angular, with close-cropped dark hair touched silver at the temples and eyes of a grey so pale they seemed almost translucent, lit from behind by something that was not warmth. His jaw was clean-shaved and hard. He was in the clinical assessment she had trained herself to apply to situations where feeling would be unhelpful, remarkably handsome, which was annoying. "I understand the terms." "You were clear in the settlement. Then I will be clear once more. I require a household managed with competence and without drama. I do not require a companion. I do not require conversation beyond what is necessary to maintain appearances in company. And I do not," he paused, and something in the quality of that pause was more eloquent than anything he had yet said, "require anything further from this marriage beyond what was stipulated." An heir. That was the word the document had contained, tucked between paragraphs about the Haverfield estate and the annual allowance. An heir, when required. She had noted it. She had not told her father. "I see," she said. "I hoped you would," he replied. And he left, and the rain continued, and Eleanor Vane sat in the vast south drawing-room of Moor Hall, Yorkshire, listening to the fire settle, and did not weep and did not protest and did not do anything at all except fold her hands in her lap and begin to calculate. What no one in that house yet understood was that Eleanor had been calculating for 4 years. Since she was 22 and the first creditor's letter had arrived, addressed to her father and been intercepted by her, because her father, the Honourable Mr. Vane, was a man of excellent feeling and no practical capacity whatsoever, sold the silver in stages that obscured the full scope of the losses, and written the letters of gracious decline to the last 3 young men who had paid her attention, before word of the Vane position spread through the county. She had a mind like a steel trap wrapped in cream-coloured kid no one had ever troubled to notice. Ashfare Hall, she corrected herself. Moor Hall, the family seat. The place she now occupied as its mistress was a great house of grey Yorkshire stone, enormous and immaculately maintained and almost entirely joyless. The housekeeper, a woman called Mrs. Pemberton, who had served the previous Duke for 30 years, and regarded Eleanor with the particular circumspect wariness of one who has survived the previous campaign. They were correct. They were orderly. They were also, Eleanor saw within the first half-hour, conducted with a certain stately inefficiency that was costing the estate approximately £400 per annum. She said nothing. She made a note. The days settled into a cold formality that was, in its way, almost comfortable. Ashfire was in residence more than she had expected. She had assumed he would depart for London immediately, but he moved through the hall like a weather system, large and self-contained, appearing at dinner, exchanging precisely the number of words required to constitute civil company. Where she could see a faint line of light beneath the door, until very late in the night, he read, he wrote correspondence. He rode out at first light in weather that would have kept lesser men indoors. He was meticulous about everything except his ledgers, which she had not yet seen and suspected with a point. The household staff regarded her with neutral watchfulness, waiting to understand what kind of mistress she would be. She understood the dynamic. She had managed staff at Haverfield for 3 years, on a budget that should have been impossible, and she knew that what servants wanted was consistency, fairness, and the quiet assurance that the person above them understood how a house actually ran. She provided all three, without fuss and without performance. Mrs. Pemberton thawed approximately 3 degrees per week. By the end of the month she was voluntarily asking Eleanor's opinion on the linen rotation. She could tell because he stopped noticing her, which was, in the particular logic of a man who processed everything and commented on nothing, a form of approval. There was a portrait of a woman in the long gallery, second from the last window on the east side. She was spectacularly beautiful, raven-haired, violet-eyed, poised with the easy arrogance of a creature who had never required strategy, because beauty had always been sufficient strategy. Eleanor discovered from Mrs. Pemberton in the course of a conversation about the gallery inventory that she was Lady Rosamund Fitch, now Lady Carew, who had been understood by the county to be on the verge of accepting Ashfire's proposal 4 years prior. She had instead accepted the Earl of Carew, who was 60 years old, in poor health, and very rich indeed. The portrait had presumably been commissioned by a previous Ashfire. Nonetheless, it remained where it hung. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment on a Tuesday afternoon, with rain on the gallery windows and sandalwood from the corridor behind her, and thought, what she did not expect, what she would have been inclined to dismiss as sentimentality if anyone had suggested it, was that by the end of 6 weeks she would find herself thinking about him. Not in the way she had guarded against, not with the romantic foolishness she had schooled out of herself at 23, but in the way she thought about any complex system that had been badly damaged and was attempting to function regardless. He was lonely, in the manner of a man who has decided loneliness is simply weather, something one dresses for rather than mourns. He was precise, because precision had been the only armor available to him. She had spent enough time in difficult negotiations to recognize the posture of someone protecting a wound that had not healed. She did not tell him she had noticed. That was not what he needed. What she did instead was stay out of his study. This was, it emerged, anomalous. He mentioned it one evening in February in the manner of someone raising a procedural question. "You haven't asked to see the estate accounts," he said. They were at dinner, the candles were low. Outside, the moor was invisible in the dark, but she could hear the wind working at the eaves. "No," she agreed. "My previous housekeeper—" He paused. "I have had 3 housekeepers in 4 years." Each one attempted to reorganize the system. Was the system in need of reorganization? He looked at her across the table. It was the first time he had looked at her as if she were an interesting problem rather than an adequate fixture. "Perhaps," he said. "I expect you'll show me when you're ready," she replied, and reached for her wine. and the subject was closed, and she felt his gaze on the side of her face for the rest of the meal. It was Mr. Hartley who broke the peace, in the way that certain men always break the peace simply by existing in close proximity to money they do not own. Hartley was Ashfear's man of business. The word she privately used for him was adjuster, which she meant in the least flattering sense of the word. He arrived at Moor Hall on a grey March Thursday, unannounced, carrying a leather portfolio and a manner that suggested he considered his employer's affairs very much his own. He was perhaps 45, carefully dressed, with the particular kind of face that is always about to smile, without ever quite committing. He looked at Eleanor during their introduction in the hall the way a man looks at a purchase whose necessity he considers debatable. She was polite. She offered tea. She listened. The situation as Hartley explained it to Ashfear later that afternoon in the study, and as Eleanor learned of it that evening through the kind of household intelligence that a quietly capable mistress assembles without effort, was as follows. 2 of the estate's tenant farms had fallen into arrears not through malice or poverty. Problem in the drainage that had been destroying the yield on 300 acres for 2 seasons running. Hartley's proposed solution was to terminate the leases and let the land fallow for 3 years. The cost of the drainage solution, he had concluded, was prohibitive. Eleanor went to the estate library that evening. She found the survey maps. She found the drainage specifications. She found, behind the survey maps, a report commissioned by the previous Duke, 20 years prior, that had identified the problem and sketched a partial remediation whose materials cost, adjusted for current prices, she calculated at roughly £180. She sat at the library table for 2 hours with a lamp and the ledgers Mrs. Pemberton had by now given her access to, and she worked through it until the arithmetic was past doubt. She did not go to Ashfear that night. It was past midnight, and the hall was dark, and she was acutely aware that their terms did not include her opinion on his estate management. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind. She thought about 300 acres of flooded fields, and the tenant families who would lose their livelihoods because a man of business had arrived with an overpriced quote and an agenda she had not yet fully mapped. She went to Ashfear at breakfast. He was reading correspondence. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room, and something, very slight, very controlled, shifted in his expression. "Your Grace," she said, "I would like to discuss the drainage problem on the North Fields, if you have time." He set down his letter. "Hartley presented his analysis yesterday," he said. "I haven't yet reached a decision." "I know," she said. "I would like to present a different analysis." She had brought the survey maps. She had brought the old remediation report. She had brought her own calculations, written out in the neat, closely spaced figures she had developed during the Haverfield years, when every number had to earn its place on the page. She laid them on the table without apology, and walked him through them, standing at his shoulder, because the light was better, and because she was not going to perform diffidence when 3 families' incomes were at stake. He did not interrupt. He looked at the maps. He followed the calculations. He was a man of considerable intelligence, she had gathered, the sort who did not need a thing explained twice, and he needed it explained only once. £179, he said when she finished. 176 if we use the quarry stone from Whitfield rather than the commercial supplier. I've already written to confirm availability. He looked up at her. He was very close. She had not registered how close until this moment, and the grey eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before, which was look at her without calculation or distance. "You've written to the quarry," he said. "I wrote last night." "I hope that wasn't presumptuous." A pause. The fire in the breakfast room gave a small sound. "No," he said, "it was not presumptuous." What followed was not a transformation. She was too careful a thinker to describe it that way, but it was a change. The study door which had been closed to her was not precisely open afterward, but it was no longer quite closed. He began to leave documents on the hall table in the mornings: estate correspondence, tenancy agreements, a quarterly comparison of expenditure against revenue. And she understood this for what it was. Not an invitation and not an instruction, but something in between. The careful opening of a negotiation between two people who did not yet have the vocabulary for what they were conducting. She wrote responses when she had them. She left them beside the original documents. He read them. He did not comment directly, but the tenor of the next document was always faintly altered, as if a question had been absorbed and processed in the space between them. Meanwhile, spring was coming to the moors. The quality of the light changed, less grey, less absolute, and the fields beyond the hall began to produce a tentative green. Eleanor rode out sometimes in the mornings, on a sensible bay mare Mrs. Pemberton had produced from somewhere, and she found that the landscape which had seemed merely desolate in February had its own kind of austere grandeur that she was beginning to prefer to the soft prettiness of the Haverfield country she had grown up in. She was returning from one of these morning rides, in early April, when she came around the stable-yard and found Lady Rosamond Carew standing in it. She had not changed materially from her portrait, Eleanor observed. Still spectacularly beautiful, still arranged with that studied ease. But there was something in the eyes up close that the painter had missed or had been paid to miss. A calculation that matched Eleanor's own, but operated on entirely different materials. "You must be the new Duchess," Lady Carew said, with the warmth of a woman who deploys warmth as other women deploy daggers. "I must be," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. Lady Carew had arrived for the county spring gathering at Thornwood Park, 2 miles east, a fortnight of exactly the kind of social arrangements Eleanor had assumed would be her primary trial as Ashfear's wife. The social arrangements were easily manageable. Lady Carew was another matter. She was everywhere, in the particular way of someone who understands that presence is half the campaign. She called at Moor Hall twice in 3 days, ostensibly to return a book she had borrowed from the Ashfair library, years prior, to leave her card with some amendment of the Thornwood gathering schedule that might have been communicated by post. Eleanor received her with courtesy and noted everything. She noted particularly the way Lady Carew spoke to Ashfear, not warmly, not with the brightness of someone trading on old familiarity, but with a particular, careful gentleness that was precisely calculated to locate the wound. "You've changed Moor Hall," Lady Carew said to him one afternoon in Eleanor's hearing, with a gesture that encompassed the freshly arranged flowers in the drawing-room. Eleanor had given instructions to the gardening staff and the replaced curtains in the east hallway. "It suits you better, I think. It always wanted a woman in it." Ashfear said very little. He said very little in all social situations, but in Lady Carew's presence he said less than usual, and Eleanor, who had spent 3 months learning the texture of his silences, heard what the silence contained. It was something much more controlled than longing. It was a man holding a door shut against something he had decided, with considerable effort and over considerable time, not to let back in. It was during a dinner at Thornwood Park on the Thursday of the 2nd week that Lady Carew made her actual move. Eleanor had been watching for it and still almost missed it because it was not crude. The woman was never crude. It came in the form of a remark addressed to Mr. Hartley, who was also in attendance, and who, she appeared, Eleanor now understood, to know quite well. "I'm told the Northfield scheme was reorganized," Lady Carew said to Hartley pleasantly, at the far end of the table. "The drainage solution." "The Duchess apparently had views," Hartley replied, with exactly the emphasis that made views sound like overreach. "How resourceful," Lady Carew said. She smiled at Eleanor across the candles. "Were you much involved in estate management before your marriage? At Haverfield, wasn't it? It was perfectly placed, Haverfield, the reduced estate, the empty coffers, the family that had required rescuing. The implication that Eleanor's involvement in Ashfear's business was the grasping of a woman who had been bought and was now attempting to earn more than she had paid for. Considerably involved, she said. My father was better suited to other pursuits. She turned to the elderly Mr. Clifton on her left, who had been trying to get a word in for 10 minutes, and gave him her full attention and closed the conversation with the efficiency of someone who has decided it has served its purpose. She felt Ashfear's gaze from the other end of the table. She did not look up. It would have been satisfying to tell someone what she had seen. She did not tell anyone. She went home that night and sat at the writing table in her dressing room, under the lamplight, and thought through what she knew. Hartley and Lady Carew had a prior relationship, likely financial. Possibly more, in any case, an alliance of mutual convenience. The drainage quote had been designed to fail, or rather to succeed at failing, at some cost to the estate and some benefit to Hartley. Lady Carew's return to the county at the precise moment when a new duchess might be vulnerable to undermining was almost certainly not coincidental. She could not prove the last point. She did not need to prove it to know it. What she could do, she decided, was finish what she had started. She had been working in the mornings after her ride on a fuller analysis of the estate accounts, not because Ashfear had asked, but because the household ledgers Mrs. Pemberton had opened to her connected in ways Hartley's reports did not to the broader estate picture. By the end of April, she had assembled a document, 31 pages, methodically organized, which showed, among other things, that Hartley's management over 6 years had produced a pattern of small overpricing and delayed action consistent with someone who was being paid to manage badly. She had not accused. She had only presented the pattern and let the arithmetic speak. She left the document on the hall table on a Thursday morning, under a note that said only, "This seemed relevant." She was in the garden when he found her. An hour later, she heard his step on the gravel and turned. He was carrying the document. His expression, which she had spent 3 months learning to read, and which was still only partially legible to her, was doing something she had not seen it do before. The calculation was still there, the control was still there, but underneath both something that looked, if she were being precise about it, like the expression of a man who had been expecting winter for a very long time and had stepped outside to find the season had changed. "Eleanor," he said. He had not called her by her name before. Not once. She noticed and kept her face even. "Your Grace, this is—" He stopped. A muscle in his jaw worked. He looked at the document in his hand, and then back at her, and there was a quality of looking, as if he were reassessing something he had thought was settled. The overpricing pattern on the grain supplier. "Did you know when you found the drainage discrepancy?" "I suspected something structural," she said. "I wasn't certain until I cross-referenced the contractor invoices. Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because I didn't have enough to show you," she said. "I had a theory. You don't seem like a man who responds well to theories without evidence." Something moved across his face. Not a smile. She did not think he permitted himself those easily, or had in some time, but the shadow of one, the memory of the capacity. "No," he said, "I am not." "Also," she said more quietly, "I didn't know yet whether you wanted to know." He was still for a moment. The garden was very quiet. A thrush was doing something industrious in the yew hedge. The smell of late spring damp and the distant leather and ink scent that she had come to associate with him specifically, which was the scent of the study bleeding through into the house, was present on the air between them. "I want to know," he said, "everything you find, whatever you see." It was not an apology. He was not a man who apologized. She understood that now. understood it as the consequence of the wound he carried, rather than any particular defect of character. But it was the closest available gesture to one, and she received it accordingly. "Then I will show you," she said. He dismissed Hartley the following week, quietly and without drama, presenting him with the documented pattern and a severance that reflected its contents. Lady Carew departed from the county on Saturday, a fortnight earlier than her stated plan, without calling at Moor Hall. But the season was not yet finished with them. What no one outside that house understood, and what Ashfare himself was only beginning to understand, in the weeks after Hartley's departure, as the estate reorganized itself under the management of a woman who turned out to have been running it anyway, was that the cold terms of their marriage had begun to feel to him, not like shelter, but like walls. He was a man who had spent 4 years constructing an existence without vulnerability, and he had become very good at it, and it had been, until recently, entirely sufficient. It was no longer sufficient. He could not locate the precise moment this had become true, which unsettled him considerably, because he was a man who tracked causation. He noticed when she was not in a room. He noticed the specific quality of her attention when she was working, the slight stillness, the focus, that was complete without being effortful. He noticed her hands on ledger pages, small and ink-stained and wholly assured. He noticed that she had never once asked him to be other than he was, had never performed either hurt or warmth at him, had only been consistently, with a kind of quiet steadiness that he had not known was possible in anyone. He had spent 4 years deciding that a woman's intelligence, turned on a man's estate and feelings, was a tool being deployed for advantage. He had been wrong. Or, rather, he had been right about Rosamond and had made the error of concluding from one case a principle about the species. He stood in his study on a Sunday evening in May with the last of the spring light coming through the west window and the account ledger open on the desk, and he thought about Eleanor sitting across from him at the breakfast-room table in March, with the survey map spread between them. And he thought I told her she should thank me. The thought arrived with a kind of clarity that was close to physical discomfort. He found her in the gallery. She was looking at the portrait of Rosamond Crewe, which had not seemed relevant until this moment when he registered that she had presumably been looking at it for months and had never once asked him about it. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. She read his expression. She was remarkably good at reading his expression. He had begun to realize, and something carefully composed settled across her face. The particular stillness she adopted when she was about to be precise. "I owe you an accounting," he said several. He walked to stand beside her, looking at the portrait. "That painting should have been moved. I left it out of a kind of punishment." "To remind myself of what?" she asked. "That I had been wrong about what I thought I could read in a person." He paused. "I was wrong in the other direction as well." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the moors were going gold in the evening light, the first real warmth of the year pressing against the gallery windows. "You were not the only one conducting a transaction," she said. "I agreed to the terms. I understood them." The terms, he said, were inadequate. She looked at him. The grey eyes, his not hers, which were a calm and clear brown, nothing concealed in them that he could find, were doing something she had not caused him to do before, which was simply to be seen. "I told you," he said, "that you should thank me for taking you. You did." "I would like to retract that statement." The corner of her mouth moved, very slightly, in the direction of something. "You said it 3 months ago. It's rather late." "Yes," he said, "it is." He turned toward her, fully, and the gallery was quiet around them, and the gold light was on the stone floors, and the smell of leather and sandalwood and old canvas was in the air. "I find I am in the rather more accurate position of believing that the gratitude runs the other way." She was still looking at him. Something moved in her expression, not a fracture, not the breaking of composure she had maintained through everything. She was not a woman who broke. It was more the way a held breath releases, the way a door, long closed, opens on an unhurried hand. "It is unusual," she said, "for a duke to be so thorough in his revisions." "I am," he said, "thorough in everything." He reached out and took her hand, the one that was ink-stained at the first two fingers, and she let him, and the thrush in the garden beyond the gallery window was doing its work again in the May evening, and the moors were gold and enormous, and Moor Hall, which had been for some years a house maintained by competence and administered by cold, was beginning, incrementally, and in the manner of all things that thaw without catastrophe, to be something else. 3 months later, by which precise interval the drainage solution had been completed at £173, the north fields were yielding for the first time in 4 years, and the south drawing-room had been refurnished at Eleanor's direction with colours that were slightly warmer than the previous scheme. To a change, Mrs. Pemberton had endorsed with an approving grunt. 2 things occurred in the same week that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. The first was that the portrait of Lady Carew was quietly removed from the gallery and placed in storage. She did not witness this. She found the wall bare on a Wednesday morning and understood without asking. The second was that Ashfire, Thomas, she had begun to call him in private. It had required some adjustment on both sides. Came to her dressing-room at a modest hour in the evening with the most recent quarterly accounts under his arm and a look on his face that she had learned to identify as the specific expression he wore when he intended to say something that cost him something. "I would like," he said, "to discuss the Whitfield quarry contract." He set the accounts on her writing table. Then he set them aside because the table was occupied by the letter she was writing to her father. Haverfield was doing better, with the allowance steady and the creditors cleared, and because the accounts were, at this particular hour, not entirely the point. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said, "the accounts will keep until morning." He looked at her for a long moment with the grey eyes that had started, recently, to contain something she had not seen in them in January, which was warmth, not performed, not offered as a negotiation, but present in the involuntary and irreversible way of all things that were true. "They will," he agreed. He had not planned to say anything further. He had planned, in the manner of a man to whom declarations were not native, to simply remain. But what came out of him, quietly, in the lamplight of the room, that was now genuinely hers, was this: "I was wrong about a great many things, and I am not going to stop being grateful." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at him. This man who had told her, on their wedding night in the cold drawing-room with the rain outside, that she should thank him for being taken, who had spent the subsequent months being outmaneuvered and seen, and gently, methodically, completely known, who was standing in her lamplight at a Thursday evening in August, holding estate accounts and saying the nearest thing to sorry and love that his vocabulary permitted, and she decided that some statements required no reply. She stood up. She crossed the room. She put her hand in his, the way she had in the gallery, only this time it was not a beginning. In the years afterward, when the Ashfire estate became one of the best managed in the North Riding, and when the vain name was spoken again in Haverfield with something approaching its old ease, and when the children who came to Moor Hall came into a house that smelled of sandalwood and ink, and was full of arguments about drainage and tenant yields, that resolved, always, into a particular kind of quiet, people would occasionally ask Eleanor what marriage to Ashfire had been like. She had a variety of answers depending on the company, but in private, in the study they now shared, she sometimes thought of that first night, and the cold drawing-room, and the remark made to the rain. She had not thanked him. She had done considerably better than that.